Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, guys, how you doing? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening if you're calling in from the Maldives or something. Welcome to the third session of 21st Century Wisdom with Gregg Henriques. If you guys have been tuning in, we've had two sessions so far. The first one was about the theory of knowledge from the Big Bang to today, how humans and life, mind, culture, all the way from matter connect. Last week, we're about justification systems. The basis for the human mind isn't to do math or to reason, but to justify, to argue, and it's inherently social. We're in for a treat today. Today's going to be Gregg talking about the problem of psychology, and he's going to have a chance to jam with Zach Stein. If you guys have been before, Zach was a sense maker in residence and possibly got bombarded by the host with the question about Gregg's model. So he's coming in today. The plan's going to be Gregg lecturing for about a half hour or so about the problem of psychology, and therefore the need for coherent metapsychology, and then tag teaming with Zach to jam. And who knows, Vervaeke and Jordan Hall may Zoom bomb us, apparently maybe in the cards. So there's going to be some time afterwards also. Gregg has offered to hang out. And so this is going to be a densely packed session. And if I could just tell you why I'm excited about this session with Gregg and Zach is I've been dealing with some depression over the last couple of years. And you get to that point of being desperate where you would type in Reddit depression and read what the first guy said, and his life changed because he learned about this thing called CBT. And then you go read everything you can about it and you never do it. And then you get desperate enough and you finally do it. You go talk to a therapist and it doesn't really work. Then you learn about DBT. Then you learn about internal family systems. Then you learn about biomotive, and you learn about Reiki and body work. And every single thing, somebody has some corner of this is what worked for me. And it's like, how the hell do you make sense of this? And if we put Gregg in context, we may be at a joint point, and the world is changing in all these huge ways, and survival isn't really a question the same way that it was in the past. Of course, climate change at the big scale, but so many of the questions we have are about well-being. What is my meaning in life, and how do I have the purpose and joy, and as Zach would say, the transcendence, ensoulment, and development required? And so I'm excited today because I had Zach and I'm trying to put him into my life, and I have Gregg. And I think the great promise of what can come out of work like today is the possibility for us to make sense of all these psychotechnologies, all these different wisdoms over the ages and across continents on how we can live meaningful lives, have well-being, and kind of make sense of who we are to be able to move forward in the world. Gregg, take it away.
All right, man. Well, it's good to see all that positive energy, Anjan. So, tapped into something there. And I'm super psyched to look out, see Zach and a number of you, Christian, hey, a lot of folks I know and look forward to sharing with. So I'm going to do my thing for 35 minutes or so. And so it'll be fairly intense dive into what I call the problem of psychology. And so you'll get that. So you take a deep breath and then sort of we'll run through that. And then that's really going to end my lecture series. I'm going to bring some comments in my final one. I really hope my final one's titled Metapsych Tech, but it's really going to be an engaging conversation at much more at the level of embodied lived experiences, like how do we deal with depression perhaps, or some of the ensoulment problems that we have, how we live with others, and just what is the frame that I have say about that stuff. So I really look forward to those conversations. I invite folks to bring questions to that. I'm super psyched today. Anytime I get time to spend some time with Zach, I feel better after that. So, and so I also love being here, Peter. As I've said before, this space rocks, man. So let me fire it up and let's get this thing rolling and let's start talking about it. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right, so this is part 3 in the sense-making series, and I'm sharing with you something that I'm completely obsessed with, and that's the problem of psychology, and ultimately then why we need a new metapsychology. So let's give some framing for this. What does this have to do with wisdom in the 21st century? Okay. Well, I think of wisdom broadly defined in terms of knowledges and practices towards valued states of being. All right. And we need better knowledge about how to talk about mind. Okay. In fact, I will argue that a fundamental problem in modernity, and this is like coming off the Enlightenment, is the failure to develop a proper grammar for talking about the human mind. Okay. But what if you don't have a background in psychology? Well, some of it might be not right immediately apparent to you, but I do hope the consequence of this, the consequence of developing a grammar for talking about mind, and then when it's woven to the other elements ultimately that the unified theory brings, and then some of the brilliant insights that Zach Stein bring and other types of things, that then will set the stage for you to engage in sense making in terms of your world, your past, your relationships, and your future. And like I said, next week we'll do some metapsych tech so that if questions arise today or in any context of looking through my stuff, I'll be here to address those at a more personal, pragmatic level. So let's talk about what the problem is, this problem of psychology. The fact is that psychology's got many different meanings historically. And if you take a broad definition, it really overlaps with philosophy. In fact, I was just talking with Cadell last, who was saying, as he was leading a seminar on Freud, both Freud and Aristotle sort of started with the problem of, what is this thing called the human mind, and how do we talk, and how does mind cause matter to behave? Okay, and at that level, like, how do we understand that? It's one of the profound problems of philosophy, and that's right up against what psychology is concerned with. So at a broad definition, philosophy and psychology go very closely connected. And at the same time, modern psychology is a unique thing. And the reason is, as we'll see, is that actually it tries to apply the language game of modern science to this issue of mind. And that actually is a very, very different kind of approach. And you get into things like quantification and experimentation. And that's and not to mention sort of a set of assumptions about how the world works. So the problem of psychology sits at the fact that as we try to apply the modern language game of science to the mind, we find ourselves handcuffed with conceptual confusion. In a nutshell, if we start with what academic psychology tells us psychology is today, it's the science of mind and behavior. So we ask that, we have science, mind, and behavior. And what I'm going to articulate to you is actually, no, those things don't coherently go together, kind of surprisingly enough. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go back to the history of the field, and then you ask, well, what actually do they mean by psychology? Fundamentally, first and foremost, I would argue the earliest definition of psychology in the modern sense was to analyze the structure and content of human inner experience. This starts with what's called psychophysics, and then gets into Wundt, who is known as the father of psychology. His lab trained people in introspection so that they could report on their inner experience. But especially in America and other places, people said, no, that's not really what it means. What I mean is the functional adaptive mental life. Brilliant people like William James said, it's actually how animals and humans adjust to the world and how consciousness allows them to solve problems and engage in the world and learn. This is a functional model. And indeed, structuralism and functionalism are the two earliest modern psychologies. But it was hard for experimentalists to come along and really observe functional and structural psyche. And then you have the rigid behaviorism, especially advocated for by John Watson, and then later by people like Clark Hull and Skinner, various versions of behaviorism. But Watson himself specifically said, hey, we have to focus on stimulus and response and independent, dependent variables and naturalistic experimentation. And of course, shortly around the turn of the century, we have one of the most influential figures of all time in Sigmund Freud, who articulated, no, fundamentally what we're really dealing with here is the underlying unconscious drives and processes, how they impact consciousness and how they create psychopathology, and how we need to understand what our fundamental nature are. A brilliant psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky, who ultimately plays a role in developing a powerful model that we don't talk about much in the West, although recently we do, called Russian activity theory. Lev Vygotsky actually identifies this crisis in psychology, which is we don't know what psychology is about because each one of these are different reference points. And we have a science here that actually is anchored to fundamentally different reference points. We have a crisis of identity. It goes all the way back to 1927, at least as being an articulated, systematically articulated point of view. I'm going to fast forward through a lot. I know the history in between, but we're going to jump to modern day psychology. So if you take a class, Psych 101, or your kids take a class, Psych 101, what are you taught? Well, modern empirical psychology. And they basically say, yeah, we have this thing called science of mind and behavior. Don't worry so much about what it is. The key, they will tell you, is that just know that it's a science. Science is a powerful method. And as long as you apply the scientific method, we'll be able to transform our folk psychological understanding and get a scientific understanding of whatever mind and behavior is. Now, a thoughtful reply that students will offer, and I offered in graduate schools, well, wait a minute. If you can't make sense of the basic terms, isn't that sort of like a prerequisite for science? Okay. I had that thought early, and then I bought the method problem, and then I came back to it. And so I think that wise students of psychology will ask this question. Now, what do I mean by you can't define its basic terms? Well, there's still a approach in psychology that's alive called the behavioral approach. And they say, well, you're science. We have what's available to us as behavior. We're going to study the causes of behavioral change. And it's a modern textbook that says, hey, what is psychology? Psychology is the science of behavior. There are other psychologists say, no way. Okay. We didn't know what mind was for a while. That was the old behavioral approach. Now we do. And there is a way to scientifically study the mind. So the science of mind, or the mind, some people think of psychology that way. And we even have the emergence of cognitive science. But wait a minute, when we do science though, okay, what actually are we actually observing and measuring? Here's decades ago, a cognitive psychologist, Jordan Mandler, puts it this way. Well, actually, no cognitive psychologist worth his salt thinks of subjective experience as data. It's a construct. Your private experience is a theoretical construct to me. I have no direct access to it. What I do have access to is your behavior. In that sense, I'm a behaviorist. In that sense, everybody's a behaviorist. Okay. So now you have this issue of access. And so what is actually happening here is very useful to draw on Ken Wilber's excellent map of epistemology. The quadrants are, in my opinion, a brilliant map of epistemology, a 2x2 measure that divides epistemology up into the exterior and interior and individual and collective. And he identifies science as being fundamentally an exterior epistemology. And the language game of science is that it requires justification based on exterior or third-person empirical entities, which can then be framed by behavior. So this is actually the normative in American modern empirical science psychology is this empirical attitude from the exterior, and you get psychology being the science of mind and behavior. The most popular text in psychology, David Myers, is one of the most popular. He defines it this way, so that science of behavior and mental process, whereby behavior is what you can see, okay, and mental process is the internal subjective experiences we infer from behavior. Okay. So let's take this real fast and say, hey, well, how do we apply this? I'd love to use the example of, well, what if there were two people left in the world, and let's apply this model. So if you and I are left in the world and we're stuck on an island somewhere, I look at you and I say, okay, I see your behavior. I see you moving, and then I infer your mental processes. So that works. But if you flip it around and take it from your perspective, that's not the way it works at all. What you do is you observe both your behavioral actions of your hands and all of that. So that's all mental process for you. Okay. So actually in this two-person model, something really weird happens. What's behavior for one person is mental processes for another, and vice versa. That's actually an indication that there's surely something wrong with it. Okay. So one of the things that I want to emphasize is that scientific requirement to view the world through the exterior, okay, that sets the stage for the language of it. But the real problem, of course, is that we're going to anchor from, we're actually interested, if you think about inner experience as the primary topic of psychology, certainly one of the primary topics, actually, how do we get access to the inner experience? So this is what's called the epistemological gap, or what I call the epistemological gap is, well, in the language of an exterior epistemology, how do we learn about the interior? Okay. And that's going to create a significant problem. But let's then think, well, wait a minute, is that the right definition, inner experience? Is that the only way we can think about mental processes? And actually, Meyer's definition is not what most people or many people mean. When you look around and see what actually mental processes refer to, there are at least 3 different reference, okay? That is things in the world that they're referring to. One is that mental processes in a traditional neurocognitive model, they refer to the information processing that's representing, modeling, and coordinating overt action. So another simple way of saying this, your nervous system is an information processing system. The way it processes information, that information processing activity, oh, that's what we mean by mental. Other people say, no, what we mean by mental, those first-person experiences like seeing red and feeling sad. And still others in the tradition of Western philosophy, the actual term mind really gets most notoriously defined by Rene Descartes. What did he mean? Well, he meant like, I think, therefore I am. He meant the higher cognitive facilities of human beings involved in self-conscious reflection and reason giving. These are fundamentally different reference for mental processes, what I call the neurocognitive meaning, the phenomenological meaning, and the self-conscious justification meaning of mind. I argue that the center then of psychology's subject matter can be considered the behavior mind problem, or BM3 problem. And what I mean by that is some psychologists think of mind as behavior, some think of it as mind as cognition, some think of it as subjective phenomenology, and some think of it as self-conscious narration. I should also note there are 2 other problems I could elaborate, but in the interest of time, I'm not. So not only do we have these different epistemological issues, like what's the vantage point, exterior versus interior, and we have the different ontological reference of neurocognitive, phenomenology, and self-conscious justification. There's also this big problem in psychology as to whether the discipline is predominantly about animals or humans. Specifically, is it about all animals? Is it about some animals? Or is it about only human animals? That's one interesting problem. There's also the natural science versus social science problem, which is psychology a natural science like biology? Or is it more like a social science like sociology or somewhere in between? Okay. These are big debates in the field that very different psychologists answer in very different ways. Why is this so hard? Okay. So I want to stop here for a second and be like, all right, there's a serious conceptual problem here. It's super hard. Okay. I think Zach Stein will agree that when you look at the field, you get this unbelievable network of confusion. Okay. A fragmented pluralist of ideas. Why? Why is this so hard? I'm going to argue that we can frame the reason that it is so hard in what I call the enlightenment gap. The enlightenment gap refers to a particular inability of the science and philosophies that emerged, modern science in relationship to that's Galileo into Newton, and the philosophies from Hume into Kant, okay, that really formed the foundation of the Enlightenment. They had a gap in them. And in the shadow of that gap resides the problem of psychology. The essence of that gap, I'm going to argue, is that they never solved the proper relationship between matter and mind and social knowledge versus scientific knowledge. I'll elaborate some. So the enlightenment gap refers to the failure of Enlightenment philosophy on 2 accounts. There's the mind versus matter problem. That is, how do we actually have a proper grammar that effectively defines the relationship between mind and matter? And there's the social versus scientific knowledge problem. This second problem can be seen very clearly in the emergence of the postmodern critique of modernist knowledge, namely by authors like Foucault argued, you know, guys, you claim that you have these transcendental truths, but you actually then create power-based instantiations that legitimize people like you, i.e. white Christian men, and the processes by which then domination ensues as a function. So the tie between knowledge and power, it's not like you are just objectively transcending everything and creating truths when you start talking science. It's complicated in relation, and there are feedback loops. From a unified theory perspective, we need justification systems theory to make sense out of it. Without that, there's no real good way to understand what kind of knowledge system science is relative to other general social epistemologies and ontologies, i.e. the general narratives that cultures develop about how to make sense out of the world. Specifically, from the unified theory perspective, science emerges as a kind of modernist, empirical, naturalistic system of justification. We can actually collapse that into men's knowledge, okay? And the argument is, I'm going to use the word men's knowledge for the postmodern twist that says, hey, men's knowledge also identifies the social category dynamics and the fact that it privileges certain social category types over others. And quite frankly, we need to anchor that in a broader philosophy, a wisdom-oriented or women's frame of knowledge system in the 21st century. The other part of the Enlightenment gap is seen most clearly in René Descartes, one of the early Enlightenment philosophers, who of course famously argued for a dualist view of mind and matter. And philosophically now, we're pretty confident that the dualist view, although a very few number of philosophers have, is not very workable. This actually relates to the core fundamental conceptual problem for psychology, which is that we don't have a good frame of understanding that interior inner experience from an exterior point of view. We have an epistemological gap problem. There's also called an ontological problem. The ontological problem, I'm not going to get into, but it's basically the hard problem of consciousness, which can be thought of in terms of how does, if we frame it in natural science terms, how does the activity of the brain give rise to first-person experience? My argument ultimately is not so much about the hard problem, but the argument is that we do not have a clear theory of knowledge, a frame of reality, the human knower and knowledge systems that were built about mapping that can actually appropriately frame the relevant variables. And so in this next section, what I'm going to do is going to take some of the key elements of the tree of knowledge system and set the stage for defining science, behavior, and the institution of psychology. Specifically, the unified theory frames scientific knowledge via the tree of knowledge system and what's called the periodic table of behavior. The tree of knowledge system we covered originally in the first 2 sessions ago, and I've talked about it the Stoa before. Crucially, it identifies the cosmic evolution in terms of the ontic reality of what is across 4 different dimensions of matter, life, mind, and culture that are then mapped by scientific ontological, epistemological systems. Ontological refers to the claims about reality. Epistemology refers to how those are justified. It states that science is a particular kind of cultural system of justification that then should be divided up, and I should say basic science, and should be then divided up into 4 foundational domains, whereby matter corresponds to the physical sciences, life to the biological sciences, mind to the psychological sciences, and culture to the social sciences. This, I've long argued, sets the stage to actually create a framework for resolving the theoretical problem of psychology. It shows that matter is organized quite well by physics. Life, the dimension of life, is quite well organized by biology. However, the current chaotic structure of psychology can be thought of as a bizarre set of ideas that resides between biology from below and sociology from above, and especially in American psychology, fractured along the lines of, say, psychoanalysis on one extreme, radical behaviorism on another, and a complex arrangement of paradigms in between. The tree of knowledge argues that we can move from this state into a more unified theory of psychology, specifically by recognizing that there are 4 different dimensions of complexity linked by 4 joint points, and that we can take Skinner's foundational ideas and tie them to neuroscience, to what's called behavioral investment theory, And then we can place Freud in relationship to modern cognitive behavioral neuroscience and put that in conjunction with the emergence of the social sciences with an idea called justification hypothesis or justification systems theory, which I discussed last time. One of the consequences of this, when we look at the institution of psychology, says that actually the field has investigated very clearly two different kinds of behavior. Specifically, it's dealt with mental processes at the level of animal mental plane, and then it's also dealt with mental in relationship to human self-consciousness, the emergence of culture, and how people justify their actions on the social stage. That means that we actually should be defining psychology in two different broad domains. One is basic psychology, and the other is human psychology. This actually gives rise to what I believe is a fairly coherent map of the institution of psychology, so that we have basic psychology, which would involve basic cognitive science, comparative psychology, behavioral neuroscience, psychophysiology, and behavioral genetics. And then we have the human psychologies, human cognition, personality, social. And then we can look then at how these disciplines are extended into the applied domains, and in particular, how we get licensed health service psychologists, which is what I am by training. And of course, there's an applied dimension. These aren't strict categories where you can have basic versus applied, but there's a lot of different reasons why you could merge the two to create applied categories. And the discipline of psychology consists of ethics and consultation, defined research methods, practice skills in some areas, and research skills in the foundational. However, my focus here is going further. We need to have a frame for defining what we mean by behavior and mental processes. According to the ToK makes a very interesting claim that actually all sciences are sciences of behavior. Specifically, behavior is a concept that frames an exterior epistemology. This is a brilliant insight that Ken Wilber has. Remember that this is an epistemological perspective from the outside. The argument then is that behavior is a concept whereby you observe object field change from the outside. The tree of knowledge, and if I had more time, I'd go into this in more depth, gives rise to a new way to classify behavior, specifically the ontological kinds of behavior. And what I mean by that, very more simply, it's just the kinds of behavior we see in nature. You already are familiar with the fact that the tree of knowledge divides the dimensions of existence in terms of matter, mapped by the physical sciences, life by the biological, mind by psychological, and culture by the social sciences. The tree of knowledge builds off of these dimensions, complexity. The periodic table builds off the tree of knowledge dimensions and adds the idea that there are primary units of analysis that can be looked at the level of part and at the level of whole. Let me go into a bit more detail here briefly. So the periodic table of behavior says, yes, there are these four dimensions of behavioral complexity that give rise to the columns. And we can think about a general object field relations across each dimension. So we have object field at the matter level, organism ecology, animal, environment, and society person. But more importantly, if we think about the universe beginning as a pure energy singularity, and then there's a remarkable transformation in it that starts a differentiation process that gives rise to the formation of material particles, and they form into atoms and molecules. And then, of course, we see the expansion of the universe in terms of stars and galaxies. But in terms of our particular trail, we see about 4 billion years ago, the emergence of bioinformation systems that actually form into the structure of cells that then evolve into multicells. And then about 550 million years ago, we see neural networks getting into animals with brains and complex bodies. They form into family groups. Then about 50,000 years ago, we see clearly a full symbolic justification system emerging, gives rise to individuals that have self-conscious justification, and ultimately family nations studied by the social sciences. My point here, which could have been delineated a little bit more, but what I'm trying to emphasize for our purposes to set up the final part of the talk, is that the domains of science divided by dimensions, levels, and scale set the stage for understanding science as developing a taxonomy of behavior of different kinds. This is going to be crucial because in order to define psychology as the science of behavior and mental process, we need to know that it's not behavior in general, but a particular kind of behavior that we're interested in. Specifically, we are interested in mental behavior, which in turn has 3 or more different meanings. And I'm not going to then delineate the key elements of mental process. So grounding this analysis are a couple of maps that, again, we'll potentially discuss, but I won't get into. There's a frame on this. The third branch or third key insight of the unified theory is called behavioral investment theory. It gives rise to a neurocognitive functional view about how the nervous system, the human nervous system, processes information. And last time I talked about justification systems theory, which emphasized the domains of human consciousness, your phenomenological experiential domain, your internal narrator, and your public narrator. Okay. And so what this does is this creates a way of corresponding our neurocognitive processes with consciousness. This is going to set the stage for us to realize and create maps of the various domains. So recall that I said that there were 3 different mental reference: neurocognitive, there were phenomenology, and there are self-conscious justification. The 2 ideas that I just mentioned set the stage actually to then map these domains. And what I want to articulate here is that we can think about the different reference that emerge from these different domains. Mind 1, or the first referent, is analyzed from an exterior epistemological view. How do we generate a model of neurocognitive functionalism? We studied the animal's actions, and then we studied the changes in the nervous system and the way in which the nervous system processes information and communicates between various domains. So a neurocognitive functional analysis of behavior is a scientific stance that examines animal behavior from the outside. Phenomenology is contained from the inside. This is an interior epistemological view, okay, that's available only through the first-person perspective. Interesting fact about self-conscious narration is that it's available through the skin. You are hearing my narrative thoughts right now as I share them publicly, and they exist on the outside. So each of these different ontological references also have different epistemological considerations that need to be taken into consideration. And that's what makes them so different, is that not only are they ontologically different, they're epistemologically different as well. So recall that psychology's problem was that it had an enormous difficulty in corresponding the interior consciousness with an exterior view of behavior. What I'm going to suggest to you by the frames that I've offered is that we can now create a system where we can connect these domains a lot more readily. There's a foundational mind 1, which can be defined behaviorally in terms of functional awareness and response, mind 2, which in terms of phenomenology, and mind 3 in terms of justification. Now, in terms of the perspective on interior versus exterior, we can observe overt actions from the outside, and we can infer neurocognitive processes as the information instantiated and processed by the nervous system. There's also the public justification, what I'm talking to you right now as I explain what it is that I'm thinking, and the private narrative that I might have as I filter out thoughts. This is the exterior epistemological systems. And then we have an interior epistemological system. So now what we have is the appropriate ontological reference referenced against the various epistemological vantage points. Ultimately, then, this is going to set the stage for a proper map of the domains of mental process. So at the exterior, we have from the exterior information processing view, we have the activity of the nervous system explained in information terms and physically held and mediated through neurobiology. We have the overt activity of what the animal's doing. We have the internal phenomenology of the experiential self. We have the private system of justification and what's publicly shared. This actually is what I call the map of mind 1, 2, 3. And what it affords us, I believe, is the proper descriptive system for delineating the various domains of mental process. It defines mental process as behavior, as cognition, as phenomenology, and as self-conscious reflection, both public and private. As such, it provides a framework to understand the behavior mind problem with coherence and effective interrelations between the domains. We can line the map of mind up
Greg, you went mute.
Greg, we can't hear you right now. Can you hear us? Still can't hear you. Looks like Greg, we heard you for a second there. It seems like there may be a problem with your internet.
Sorry.
Oh, we can hear you now.
How about now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes? Okay. I'll just go with this then. Go back to share screen. Okay. So behavioral investment theory is about mind 1. Just is about mind 3. And the work I'm doing with John Vervaeke on untangling the world knot fundamentally is centered on mind 2. And John's model of recursive relevant realization across scale multi-layered modeling sets the stage for us to link neurocognitive functionalism into phenomenology and ultimately into propositional knowing. Last comments I'll make in relationship to, this is a very individual world. I had a mentor, Paul Wachtel, talk one-person psychology, and often we need to move towards two-person psychology. I am a big believer in that. The relational world is an absolutely central part of our development. I'm sure Zach will appreciate that. And this James Mark Baldwin quote, that ego and alter are born together. So what about the relational world? I'm not going to get into it, but there's a thing called the influence matrix that basically says we live in a self-other matrix, that our whole socio-emotional ensoulment really is defined at birth by a relational dance with our parents, and then with our peers, and then with our lovers, and our place in the social group. We seek high relational value, and then we navigate high relational value across power, love, and freedom. And our emotions get activated in relationship to that. Again, I'm flying through this I need to give voice to the fact that so much of our mental life is relational. It sets the stage then to think about these concepts in terms of how we develop an implicit intersubjective frame. And I think that's exciting because it sets the stage for an idea that maybe mind 2 is more than just inside of us, but actually we can develop models of shared attentional space and intersubjective space that then gives rise to the possibility of a cool concept of mind to be. So when you look into the eyes of another and you feel their presence and your mirror neurons are all syncing up with their mirror neurons, the idea that actually we're attuned to an intersubjective space is very compelling to me. I believe that we can track self-other relational dynamics with enormous sophistication. And those of you that have been in long-term relationships where you feel known and valued, I've been married to my wife, we were high school sweethearts together, we know each other extremely well. And I would argue we've created an intersubjective, interpersonal, participatory space that of course is narrated by our own narration, but is also a participatory relational dance that then gives rise to this question of whether mind to be it would be a reasonable constructed space. And that connects then our phenomenology with each other in a dynamic way. In sum, the unified theory provides a meta-psychology that addresses the problem of psychology and acknowledges it's coming from the enlightenment gap, divides the subject matter into the problem of behavior in general and the 3 domains of mental process, gives the tree of knowledge system and periodic table of behavior to show how to define behaviors and science, offers the map of mind to define the mental domains in neurocognitive, experiential, and self-conscious, and offers the influence matrix to frame self-other dynamics in the relational world. Now, that's a high-tech cut through, okay, in relation. I would argue that we can take such a proposal and analyze it for analytic purposes, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's able to do what we need to be able to do. So I would argue if we could somehow link it with a meta-psychology grounded in an educational philosophy and human development, then we could really start to develop a model to foster the prosper education in a time between worlds. And with that, I will hush up and invite Zach Stein to hang with me for a little while and discuss some of these issues.
Wow, thank you, Greg. Should I just kind of reflect on my impressions of your talk, or did you have a sense of where you'd like me to go?
Hold on 1 second. I can't hear.
Okay.
Okay.
You got me?
Good. Yeah, I can hear you now. So
Good. Did you want me to go in a particular direction, or should I just extemporaneously?
there it is, brother.
Okay,
Whatever
gotcha.
the hell you will with it.
Awesome. No, I mean, as I said in my talks here on metapsychology, like, there's a huge problem with psychology as a scientific field. And it dawned on me in graduate schools, it dawned on you that this whole thing is a little bit ill-defined here. And where I found it was, in fact, more because in the naturalistic fallacy, right? In the sense that there's a whole bunch of our experience, which is, properly speaking, definitely essential to psyche, to mind, which is normative, which is about ought, what you ought to do. And it's a sense of being enclosed in a normative field. Like in a family is a great example of this, where it's like, what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And so what I discovered in psychology was that it was only an entirely descriptive, right? So it's a descriptive science and an explanatory science. But you can't get any prescriptions out of descriptions in a simple way. So there's this whole realm of human experience, which was the experience of the normative, the experience of ethics and what one ought to do, which simply couldn't be handled. And so I realized that either, we need to think about psychology very differently, which is what I ended up doing, or we need to basically jettison the pretense that this is a science at all. I think, so that's the first bit, is that we're completely on the same page there. And my way into this actually ended up being the American pragmatists, because it's interesting when you list and I wrote a paper in a book of essays about integral theory and philosophy, where I compared Ken Wilber and the American pragmatists. And if you look at the American pragmatists, Dewey, who was a psychologist, he wrote a textbook of psychology. He was core in that functionalist group, University of Chicago. William James, right, arguably the father of psychology. And then
Certainly
you get
American.
Exactly. And Charles Sanders Peirce, who was also, he was, as I mentioned in my lectures, the first experimental psychologist on the American continent, actually was translating Wundt and in correspondence with Wundt. So there's this really interesting way that group there remained both philosophers and psychologists at the same time, and were aware of some of these complex kind of aporia or paradoxical dimensions when you try to get into psychology in particular ways. So what's interesting about the pragmatists was that they ended up being profoundly fascinated with this emergent theory of evolution, right? So Darwin he had just existed, like he had just
right.
So there's a sense that the evolutionary worldview was radically new. Right. And so the pragmatists became really infatuated with this. And there was a tension in the pragmatists, and this is spoken about by Robert Brandom, tension between the, basically the continuous view and a discontinuous view of humanity's place in evolution. So I've just been, Jordan Hall just joined. So he'll be picking up. You can grab that chair, bro. And so this is kind of what is part of the problem of psychology, is that, so part of this problem of psychology is that, the human is distinct in the animal realm. So it's, and this is the discontinuous view. And so this would be the view of like Charles Sanders Peirce, for example, who was saying basically like, we can't reduce human behavior to animal behavior. There's something distinct. And for him, it was this realm of the normative, of the ought. And he was a logician and a mathematician. And so his concern was very much with the laws of reasoning that weren't descriptive natural laws. They were normative laws. They had almost a deontological quality to them. right? Which is a way of describing the structure of normative experience. So there's this discontinuous view, like articulated with Peirce, like, no. The human is, yeah, we may have evolved from monkeys, but we hit this point, and in, like, where we emerged into, I think, what you would call mind 2B, but I would argue that might be mind 3B.
Yeah,
which
mind
is
3B.
which is Geist, Geist, where you
mind 3B is Geist, 100%.
Exactly, like, so the Hegelian notion of like entering into the collective spirit of the ought, right? Which is when you enter the social field of like a family, there's a sense of the way one ought to be, and it's not, sometimes it's not even articulate. And so for Peirce, like, mathematics was the clearest example. Like 2 + 2 is 4,
right?
Like, it's not a law of nature, that's a law of mind, which is normative, which is a different kind of law of nature. And in ethics, according to Kant and et cetera, you know, and brought up through Hegel and Peirce, you get this sense that the moral law, which we are responsible for creating, is continuous with natural law and the evolutionary laws, but also in a sense unique. So there's a discontinuous view of humanity's place in evolution. But then Dewey took the continuous view. Dewey was very interested in the ways that human being and cognition and psychology were continuous with the biological kind of like machinations of evolution. And so then that's been a tension in the field ever since. And I think for the most part, we've been wading towards the continuous view. We've been very interested in all of the things humans and animals have in common, and kind of intending with evolutionary psychology often to reduce human behavior to evolutionary precursors, and which Baldwin had called out early as the genetic fallacy, but this is another issue. So I just want to put that on the table and say, like, so there is this tension in the field. And what I was drawn to in my studies in psychology was the discontinuous view. And so Piaget and Kohlberg being my exemplars of that, where Piaget was interested as a biologist in the emergence of necessary knowledge. This is interesting. So, like, how do you get from a completely contingent biological process that emerges over time, a form of reasoning which deals with timeless truths? And from a non-necessary, random seeming evolutionary process, you get necessary forms of cognition, like 2 + 2 is 4, which presumably was something like the case before there was even a human mind. So it gets very.
Mathematics is a good question.
What is mathematics, right? Where is, or like in a weird way, where is mathematics?
Amen.
And so that's was interesting to me. And so this sense of, okay, there's this, and so when you were saying, in fact, one of the problems with psychology is that we don't have a good way of kind of looking at interior states from the outside, registering that. So Wilber places this in zone 2 of his model, which is developmental structuralism, which is the one perspective missing from your book, which I've called you out.
Hey man, there are a couple of things that are missing, and you highlighted a few of them, and I appreciate that.
Right. So Piaget and Kohlberg in particular.
We had that process.
Where what you're looking at is you're looking at the emergence from basically quasi-animal forms of processing in infancy into the justification systems, and therefore into these nested normative structures of justification, moving up and through those. So this is kind of where I would place that developmental structuralist tradition in your model. It would be right in the justification systems, and then articulating them as these evolving justification systems. And what's interesting about the Piagetian view in particular was that, he used no statistics. Kohlberg also used no statistics. What they did was basically look at live human behavior and do a form of structural analysis that was concerned with the normative dimension. This is what's important. Kohlberg wasn't trying to describe moral behavior. He was trying to look at the nature of moral justification systems as they evolve. And built into the model was the idea that the higher justification system is the preferable justification system. And now you're into a mode where you can actually bridge from the is to the ought. And so this was a big deal for Kohlberg, and Habermas plugged right into that and kind of lifted off from there.
Beautiful.
So that notion of, as Robert Brandom describes it, who's this very important philosopher, picks up from the American Pragmatists.
Yeah, you introduced me to him.
Yeah, he works at the level.
But
He's very hard to read. He's got a great beard, and he works in the Cathedral of Learning, which is this building at the University of Pittsburgh. Anyway, so total badass. But he writes about the justification systems in particular in this rigorous philosophical way, and he makes this distinction between sapience and sentience.
Yeah.
And so that's one of these things where it's like when you're looking at the emergence of the individual human and on ontogeny, right, through the out of the crib and into and then on to whatever, you're looking at the kind of movement up out of sentience and into sapience,
right,
which is one of these, mind 1 into mind 2 into mind 3. By mind 3, you're in the full blown sapience.
Right. I prefer the term person for that, actually.
Person, right? Totally. So yeah, and that I think is actually, in a sense, the harder problem than the so-called hard problem. And this was a point made by Wilfrid Sellers, Brandom's teacher, which was that it's not so much how kind of sentience emerges from matter. It's actually the weirder problem is how sapience comes out of nature, which is to say that emerging from animal sentience, animals are they're conscious, they're totally conscious. From the emergence of that, you get, again, 2 + 2 is 4, and laws of logic, and scientific hypothetico-deductive processes. And a really interesting
that's the black hole I fell into in 1996. That's where I fucking dropped into 1996.
Totally. So that's me reflecting on your lecture, which I thought was a brilliant overview of the problem of psychology as a field. And as I said in my talks, my resolution was different. I didn't attempt to tangle too much with the sciences and started to work in that realm of the normative and in the developmental structuralism. So I've said a mouthful, so I'll pause there.
Let me riff off of that and then see if other people. So you're 100% correct, okay, in my estimation. So that's a wonderful articulation. It's another set of angles on the problem. There are a lot of problems with psychology. Okay, there's just so many different angles. The normative one's really key. I came into the normative one because I entered into the field actually at the psychotherapy level. Okay, so I backed into this in a different way. So in the world of psychotherapy, where you are given the charge of being normative, okay, so if you're a therapist, you're there for a reason, right? And then you have to decide what is healthy, and then really what is good, and then what's not good, okay? And then, but I was seeking coherence, and I was like, well, let me at least get rid of some of the normative problem and turn around and look at the science of psychology. And then when I tried to do that, I fell into evolutionary theory, but it was also the case then that I discovered just how convoluted this whole problem was. And I also then discovered the normative problem around evolutionary psychology, which was basically, there's a big problem, right? When you start getting into, when Freud makes claims about what we are, we become what Freud says that we are, okay? This is what in sociology becomes the double hermeneutic problem, okay? Anthony Giddens is a sociologist who identifies the double hermeneutic. This is actually how I got hooked into the normative problem through sociology. My first mentor was a sociologist. So physics is a single hermeneutic discipline, which means physicists have to get together and decide what the hell an electron is, okay? But if social sciences get together and they say, oh, well, you are that women out there, oh, you guys all have castration, anxiety, penis envy, and there's castration anxiety. And now this is going to dictate the social normative rules and the identities that we have. Now your scientific claims have feedback loops on exactly value-based claims that people become. It's another angle on the normative problem, okay? And so it was a clusterfuck. I mean, there's no way to make sense out of it, at that level. Until then you realize, then I fell into the justification hypothesis and systems. And the thing about that is that cuts humans off, right? It creates the joint point around humans. Now you have human through the portal of justification. You now identify, oh, well, all of these secondary problems actually now are clustered off. They're not solved, but they're clustered off. And now you have the primate to person interface or difference. And then you get the continuity plus the discontinuity that had been so long this battle of, well, is it continue? Well, it's both continuous in the sense that we're behavioral investing primates, and then it's discontinuous because then the evolution of propositional language, you know, that was the insight. Evolution of propositional language sets the stage for the problem of justification. Jordan behind you wrestled with that, ironically, at the exact same time I was wrestling with it in 1997, 1998. And it was like, oh my God, this is a real feedback loop dynamic. So anyway, that created another way. It allowed me to frame the problem in a way that historically hadn't, and gain some traction on it. And the other thing I'll say real quick before is why I need to say why I think your model of metapsychology is so brilliant and been influential. Okay, so I'm a clinician, and we're studying what is it to be healthy. Okay, and then what is it to be healthy in the 21st century in this time between worlds? That to me is what Zach Stein's offering. And what it means to be healthy is to understand that we're being driven towards skill development through a capital labor structure and an educational achievement oriented structure. Okay, but the modernist system, which cut the legs out from under theology, and Ken Wilber's brilliant on this, cuts the legs out from goodness and beauty, extremely emphasizes truth, and then we become hyper developed on skill development, but our ensoulment and our transcendence is shriveled, you know? And that's a huge, profound problem humanistically. And so fundamentally what we need to do is we need to transform our educational processes in the deepest sense of the word to cultivate a deep and rich ensoulment and the quest for transcendence. And we balance those three out, and we will cultivate whole humans going forward.
Beautiful. I mean, lots of reflections there, you know. Yeah, as you were saying, you mentioned Vygotsky, which I thought was awesome because he doesn't get enough play. And in my lectures, I mentioned Michael Tomasello, who at the Max Planck Institute, who did these comparative psychology studies. And they're saying the same thing. You know, they're basically saying like that what's distinct about the human isn't intradermal. It's not within your skin. In fact, it exists between us. And that intersubjectivity, more specifically, joint attention, is one of the things that actually it's a condition for the possibility of propositional and differentiated speech. So there was actually, so there was something that happened kind of quote unquote first. And it's one of these weird things where it's not really worth getting too specific, but something happened first where the human potential for joint attentional space, which means you and I together, both looking at this thing, knowing that we're both looking at this thing,
right,
and working on it together. And when you study monkeys, because they don't do that, our experience of animals is of domesticated animals. So dogs have co-evolved with us to basically hold joint attention with us in a strange way. But monkeys, natural behavioralistically, don't do anything near, like, for example, following a point. Right. My point, even a very young child will follow my point and look at what I'm pointing at. Monkeys don't do that spontaneously in the wild, basically ever. And so Tomasello has nuanced many of these claims to show experimentally that it's the case. So there's something there about the space between us, which you talked about with your wife kind of beautifully, the mind 2B or mind 3B or something there, which emerges. And if you look at McGilchrist's work, The Master and the Emissary, he actually does this crazy thing where he looks at the structure of the skull and the structure of the vocal cords in terms of archaeology. Mm-hmm. And the record suggests basically that we had full-blown vocal cords before we had the cranial capacity for something like propositionally differentiated speech. But we had this it was a big brain. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a hominid brain, but it wasn't the modern human brain. But we had full vocal cords, which means we could imitate any noise in the forest and sing beautifully. So he actually suggests that we were right brain dominated, singing species, coalescing joint attentional space in a massively complex way. And it was out of that harmony that propositionally differentiated speech was like taken out and up and turned into this special thing. And then we moved to this left brain dominated evolutionary period. And that, when I read that, I was like, oh my God, first of all, it's beautiful. Thinking about the singing humans in the like prehistoric forest with complex social structures maintained through song. But then there's also something that rings true for that phenomenologically in our own experience, which is that the main function of speech isn't the transmission of content, although that's one of the things we're doing. It's the creation of that space between us, the mind 3B in particular, where we create a normative field that we participate in. And it's only in those normative fields, if I can say something weird, that you can save your soul. Which is to say, like, once you're up and through that joint point, you're in the properly human speaking place, you get into these processes of ensoulment where it's about what's the normative field you're creating with your tribe / people / civilization, and how are you doing in it?
Right, but it channels the soul up through the person then part, because it's also the case that that soul part is then connected to your primate phenomenology, right? I mean, you're embedded in all the desires that you have, the intuitive desires, right? But now you come up, you share the space, and now you have the awakening of justification and the awakening of the normative space that you're in, that then reflecting back. And it is that reflecting back part for me that makes the human soul so sort of unique and often so troubled, okay? Because it then becomes this self-society dynamic, right? Who am I relative to who do other people want me to be? Yeah. And all the potential struggles for that.
Yeah, I mean, animals don't get neurosis, right? Like dogs.
Well, we give it to them in the lab, and
you can give an animal neurosis, but that's through like torture, trauma. They're not adjusting to a linguistically mediated normative field. You know what I'm saying? And like judging themselves in relationship to that field. Right. So animals don't experience neurosis. Now they experience pain, intense pain.
Of course.
And then animals don't experience existential angst. You know? And young humans often don't experience, thank God, don't experience existential angst. So as you move up and into more complex justificatory systems through the process of human development, you actually get a richer potential for pathology and dysfunction at every step, which is why, as you were describing with the enlightenment move, you can actually get brought up and into this weird left brain emphasis, hyperlinguistic, hypermathematic abstraction of experience, because you've moved up and into it, not realizing that there are other dimensions of experience.
Well, and then Kant convinces, and other people, and certainly Plato had this also, they convince you, there's the convincing of that the form is transcendent at some various level, that the ultimate a priori abstractions, the math is real, okay? And then, and now all of a sudden you're at a level of, and of course the Eastern traditions get this, and at least Taoism, most notably, the Tao ain't the Tao. So if you're talking about it, it ain't it, right? And that's the Eastern traditions keep practical philosophical embodiment much better than the Western traditions. Western traditions shoot off.
Totally, yeah. A lot to say on Kant. I like Kant. I wouldn't throw him.
I don't know. Alexander Bard always yells at me. He's like, "You're between Hume and Kant," and I'm like, "It's a decent place to be. I can hang here. That's what American psychology convinced me. Now I can transcend that. But I'm hanging out there."
Yeah, it's better to be between Kant and Hegel, or between Hegel and Peirce.
Well,
and because Kant knew that judgment was a deontological affair, which is to say that when you're up and in a judgment system and you claim something that's the case with the world, it's not just an epistemological claim, it's also a social claim, and one that you've committed yourself to as a person. So there's something about that, which Brandon pulls up and through Hegel, and talking about the normative facts that we're committed to in a justificatory system make us who we are.
Yep.
Like your beliefs, you're responsible for your beliefs. And so to hold a belief means that you're responsible for all the things that are connected to that belief. And when you get new beliefs, to update your beliefs. Like this is there's an epistemological responsibility that we hold. So Kant was kind of like hanging out there. And so is Piaget. He was basically saying, as you become more mature, especially as you get into formal operations and you can do hypothetical deductive thinking and hold counterfactuals and those kinds of things, there's also this necessary moral development that has to take place, because you've just entered a new realm of responsibility and agency. And that's when the ensoulment kicks in, usually around adolescence, when you're like, holy crap, you get a longer time horizon. And you start to get richer emotional experience hormonally, and you start to relate so deeply to other people, and you realize that there are these profound consequences to your actions, which no animal could understand, like betrayal. or things like that. And again, I'm stressing the discontinuous view. If you want me to talk the continuous view, I can do that all day, like biosemiotics and the emotions of animals and even plant consciousness. So we can do that. But I'm stressing the discontinuous view because it needs to be said, because being a human means being responsible for what you say. And the dynamics of teacherly authority that I talk so much about just simply don't work unless we understand epistemological problems from this ethical frame. That's
why when the scientific humanistic unified theory extracts out into ultimate values of dignity and well-being and integrity. Okay? I mean, those are, so when it's like, this is not just a scientific enterprise, it's a philosophical enterprise, which means you have the ethical problems. You have the fundamental problems of implication, and what might and ought to be are all now entangled. And so for me, so it was like, yep, nope, because I'm my therapist heart, my scientist mind, and they're working together, and it's going to be a dialectical whole. And ultimately, an ethos is framing this guide.
Totally. That was fun.
Hey, man.
Jordan, you're here. Do you want to say anything? You don't have to.
Just I hope somebody wrote down, being a human means being responsible for what you say. That's a big one. Think about the implications of that if we just kind of drove that home and took that seriously. Has a very nice tone to it. It sounds like a well-rung bell to me.
It will, yeah, I'll add a word in there because I would learn this in my studies in psychology. I'll say being a human person. And the reason of the person is that this guy, Peter Rosario, who was a theoretical and descriptive psychologist, was like me, obsessed with terms. And then he basically honed in on what is a person. And basically it argues that a person is an entity that can take responsibility on the social field and is often forced to give accounts and can give accounts and be responsible. Okay. And that what he argued you do, and I think in a very powerful way, it's consistent with many cultural anthropological views, is essentially that when you have a child, me and my 3 kids, I'm essentially development, socialization. I am turning human beings into human persons. Okay? And so as they learn and as who they are, and my daughter, come down and say, don't eat the cookies. I go upstairs, the cookies are gone. I didn't eat them. Well, you got shit all over your face. It's like, we're going to hold you accountable in a particular way. And we're going to, kind of cultivate a particular way of being in this normative space, and then how to do that and how to regulate our primate cells and our person cells to create human being fulfillment. And it is about taking responsibility. I mean, I think Jordan Peterson shoots across the world in part because, there's rights. Well, we actually want to be held accountable. We want to be able to move the rock and do that. And that dialectic is absolutely key for our reaching our potential, in my estimation. Rights, responsibility.
Yeah. Sorry, just as you guys were, as I'm thinking about that, it's the space between human and human person is an extraordinarily rich niche for bad if you don't actually hold that line. Right? The capacity to show up as a simulated person, just to be a human but not to be a human person, and play the justification game exclusively for the purpose of using it to manipulate the field around you and take zero responsibility is the niche. Right? That's the niche of the, Tyson talks about the the narcissist as the thing that is the Achilles heel of civilization.
Amen.
Yeah,
totally. And that's why that integration and the proper normative values are so unbelievably essential for sustainability. If we don't have proper normative values, then it gets corrupted by underlying psychopaths and narcissists.
Totally.
Yeah, you know what? That doesn't seem plausible. Never happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too because I use the word human being a lot. I use the word person. What's interesting about the word person, and specifically personhood, is that you can have non-human persons.
Right.
And this is where we get actually into something like theology, which is, of course, McGilchrist's forthcoming book is in this domain of thinking about the relation between the human persons and non-human persons, especially in the what's called like the imaginal realm. for example. So archetypal persons, which are divine persons as they relate to human persons. And it's actually related to this notion of the narcissist being the thing that's going to pull civilization apart. It's actually, in some sense, the absence of the broader normative field of the divine non-human persons, which have often been the thing which makes it so that when you meet the stranger on the road and you're between civilizations and it's just you and another person, is there a third person there?
Right.
Is there a third person there? And you'll find a lot in the Old Testament. That's what it's like. It's like these two dudes are hanging out and God was there.
Right.
And what that's referenced to is what I already said, which is this notion of Geist, which is this thing which we step into when we co-recognize personhood. But the problem is it helps to make that thing an object.
Yes.
Because it stops the narcissist and the sociopathic, psychopathic manipulations of the field. Or at least it makes it easy to shut that shit down.
Right. So one of the things, if I look at that in my own personal development, I've been weak in transcendence because my father had an experience of a Billy Graham concert, evangelicalism. Okay. And then as he went and got his doctorate, he lost touch of believing in that and then became a new atheist in the Dawkins sense. So I was raised in the new atheist Dawkins sense and then grew up with the idea that transcendent, not unlike Jim Rutt, as, it's a believing in Santa Claus, you idiots. I don't do that. Okay. It's like, no, actually, right? It's like, oh my God, it's God. It's the concept of the ultimate good and the transcendent of the orienting us in a particular way to hold our spirit and soul in alignment. And I just was blind to that for a while, but it's like, that in terms of organizing, our position in social space and in normative moral space in the cosmos, is like, that's an anchor, reflective point.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Baldwin quote, which is a great one, that ego and alter emerge together.
Right.
And in Baldwin's theory, you can only do that so long until you run out of actually embodied alters, which you can socialize against, right? And so this is the origin of the notion of the Kohlbergian post-conventional morality, right? So how do you be like a Martin Luther King or a Christ-like figure, right? Or Gandhi, when your immediate field doesn't have people who can actually see the truth that's being seen. So in Baldwin's model, you start out with your parents, you idealize your parents, and you self-regulate normatively in relation to the parents. And then he was pulling on George Herbert Mead, who I think is like the American Vygotsky, basically.
No, of course.
And so you have this broader collective alter, the social, the norms. But then you move beyond that, and it gets very complicated. You have one-off relationships with other people who are also post-conventional, but that's not technically like a community. No. So then, and Habermas actually plugged into this in his debate with Kohlberg. So then you actually create, in the imaginal realm, an idealized communication community in which you further socialize yourself beyond what your community might be trying to basically say, no, those things you're doing are actually, you ought not to do.
Yep.
Right. And this is where I think postmodernism falls short, because they're saying it's all socially constructed, that in fact, if it's good to do in this society, it's good to do regardless of what it is. But that doesn't take into comprehension the Kohlbergian post-conventional levels, which say, actually, I can norm the norms of my society from a larger prior to society position. But to do that, you need something like that larger alter in which the more post-conventional ego can emerge in relationship to. And if it's not there, then you need to create it.
Yeah. Or I mean, obviously if you're spiritual like Wilbur, or even look at somebody like Roy Bhaskar, I mean, he falls into meta-reality, right? And all of a sudden it's reflecting back to him as some ontological claim. I mean, for me, what happened to me is just an increasing abstraction. I think like Confucian theory. Like Confucian theory talks about increasing abstraction. So you become the I and the we just grows in its expanse. So you then transcend the ego. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute. There is like a larger collective good that then basically zooms out to the cosmos at some level, or certainly all sentient beings, at that level. So I'm very curious and feel that draw that takes me from my old new atheist stance of skepticism and turns it into, at the very least, a transcendent orientation, if not ontological claim.
Totally. And so it's think social and ethical interpretations in development, which is like 1901 or something, is where Baldwin lays out this model. And it's not naive. He's actually not, has a pretty sophisticated theology. And so he's not actually suggesting that the God that you're in touch with at the post-conventional levels is, the God of the Hebrews with the beard, like Yahweh and the volcano God. It's like, it's not that. It's actually, he's read Feuerbach, and he's read, the more sophisticated takes on the nature of religion. But he's still positing that there is something essential, almost like to mental health and further development, which I put in both the ensoulment and the transcendent camps, which you pointed out are missing in our contemporary culture. There is something about the imaginal expansion of the justificatory system and the normative field in which you reside, which is to say, there's something that we're committed to that isn't, strictly speaking, socially constructed. Now, we may not have the truth in our hands, but as Habermas posits, like the condition for the possibility of talking to one another at all is something like positing truth. And similarly in the ethical realm, so there's a way to get at that. I think there's a way to get at that. But now we're far beyond psychology, even though we're talking about the most important things that the human mind does. And so this is what kills me about the field of psychology and draws me to philosophy. The inadequacy of the simply descriptive and explanatory models in the realm of the normative.
Totally. I mean, this is why any coherent psychology needs a meta-psychological reflection point. Right? I mean, you need, and if you deny it and think you reduce it to empiricism, you're just corrupt. Come on, sorry. I mean, that's why, of course, I can't hang out with my academic friends anymore, because that leaks out of me pretty quickly.
It's not just that, Greg.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's 10 minutes left or something. Should we see if there's a few questions that we could kick
Actually,
around?
that'd be great. Right. I lost track of time as often, Zach.
One question that came up earlier in the chat for both you guys was, give me 1 second to find it. What does a game B education look like that takes in these frameworks into mind?
What does a game B education look like that takes in these frameworks of the mind? That's a super interesting question.
I'll take that. At least, obviously, there are a lot of different ways. But I was inspired. I heard Daniel, I think it was in his first Digital Porch one. He was talking a little bit about the Concilium Project and some game B issues, talking so much about the incentive structure. Okay. So from my vantage point, what happened with capital labor systems, all right, is I'll back up. I learned something as my unified theory developed about the nature of what I first called social influence. Okay. Coming from an evolutionary psychology view. Hold on. From an evolutionary psychological view, I was just trying to influence my kids back there. Okay? You basically want to move your people around, okay, in accordance with your interests. All right, that's one. And of course, for reproductive and survival kind of issues, all right, that's a functional and instrumental view. But I'm also a clinician. All right. So one of the things that becomes very apparent when you're working with clinicians, you see people have high influence, all right, but they're not necessarily fulfilled or happy, all right? They feel a deep and profound disconnect between the power and control that they have, as long as they have a feeling heart, and say not being valued, okay? So if you're dominant and you have to be a jerk in order to control people, if you have a feeling heart, you resent that. But the nature of the mechanism of the incentive structure is that it overvalues influence in relationship to, first, relational value. That's the experience of being valued by other people. And then finally, I learned that it's actually not just being valued, but it's fundamentally about being known and valued. Okay. So what we want the alignment of our capacity to influence, our being valued, and our being known. What does that do? That orients your heart, your head, and the relational field with coherence. Okay. When you're not that, has anybody ever felt like an imposter sometimes, right? When you feel like an imposter, you're dropping out into the persona to try to regulate value and influence, but they don't know you. And then you're afraid that you could be discovered, okay? And now you have a split between your public self and your private self. Carl Rogers knows all about that and about how the suffering that can entail, all right? So what am I saying? From a game B perspective, what's happened with game A and its competitive structures, and then especially accelerated with the capital labor relations, is that it's created an instrumental efficiency dynamic where basically we overvalue influence and undervalue relational value and being known and valued. We just punt that off to the family, but we're actually also culling out all the family roles and getting it more and more efficiently productive. So we're turning everything into an influence game, and it's killing our soul. All right. So what we actually need to do is we need to arrange the contingencies to create a commons that enables a fundamental fit shared sense of belonging, of relational value, of shared resources. That's why I love the Stoa so much. The Stoa is a fundamental place where you can actually come, learn, be valued. It's not instrumentally contingent. So for me, one of the fundamental shifts from game A, game B is, get out of instrumental contingency. It makes you feel alienating and controlling, and get into your heart and connect with other people.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote this whole book, which was a lot about this. You know, it was about the fact that the civilization we're in, the basic patterns are suicidal, you know, and that this can't last. And one of the main autopoietic functions or self-reproducing functions of that civilization is this massive modern educational bureaucracy that we've built. And I'm talking historically unprecedented. And for a time, like, holy cow, like a dignity of modernity. But, you know, that form of education, that form of institutionalized schooling became, or maybe never was, separate from the kind of relation between the state and capitalism as a mode of production, if I can say that. So the thing was amazing, but it was always creating warped humans, just to speak quite bluntly. But for a time, it was okay to do that in a sense, because there were so many other things that were growing with society, and the alternative of not doing that would have actually been worse. So it's a very complex question about urbanization, especially in the United States, and what to do with these large groups of working class people, and how to create something like a meritocratic society, and other questions like that. So although I'm super critical of modern school systems and think they should be completely dismantled, I am also taking a view of like a dialectic here, where every time you solve a complex social problem, you've now created a new social problem. And schools have now become a problem, in the sense that because of the ubiquity of low-grade surveillance in all schooling experience, and because of the total capture of reductive human capital theory as the dominant meta theory driving educational reform, and therefore the sharp end of the stick of standardized testing coming in to basically codify that mode of human capital decision-making, that has made the schools, I think, on the net, and I say this in my book, and people have thought it may be controversial, on the net, it's actually sometimes worse to have gone to school. Especially if you're learning disabled or from particular minority groups and other things, where it's like, this is a very corrosive and damaging institution. So the first thing about game B schooling and education, well, actually, let me say it more clearly. The first thing about game B education is that it is not schooling, right? And so then you have to start to think in a very interesting way, well, then which forms of education are we going to kind of like rehearse or refresh? And then which ones are we going to create anew? And so I'm particularly drawn to the guild models as the models of educational innovation that could get us on the other side of this time between worlds. In part because one of the main problems I'm seeing that's like a side effect of this dysfunctional education system is the childhood and adolescent mental health crisis. Some of that is the result of them having what David Graeber would call bullshit jobs, right? School is basically been whittled down to just a competitive game for eventual advantage in the job market. but you're not actually working on anything that matters to anyone but you in terms of your grades and then your future prospects. So every school assignment is worthless, right? You're not actually doing anything. Now, adolescents in particular can solve real problems in the world that actually need solving, but instead they're solving made up problems so that they compete with other adolescents to then, get ahead eventually with a job. And so I'm saying, actually, we could start integrating young people into guild-like structures and alleviate the insanity-making position of spending all of your time doing bullshit work, competing with your peers, instead of spending your time collaborating with your peers, doing actual work. And work is something that you do that matters to somebody else in a very serious way, to the extent that they can't even do their work or survive if you hadn't done your work. Like, children and kids can do that. And in the absence of doing that, which is a position many adults find themselves in who have bullshit jobs or no jobs, in the absence of doing actual work, you go crazy. I mean, it's hard. It's very difficult because this notion of being known, being valued, right, that you're mentioning, you can't feel it. You can't feel how you gear in. So all of the young people feel that they're burdens. And then they flip that into a kind of entitlement, and so so that's the first lesson. We have to get out of this notion of schooling, and then we have to get into something different, which allows the young people who are on the receiving end of this intergenerational transmission. And it's a lot. We've built a very complex situation here that these kids are coming into. They need to learn a lot of skills to do that learning in something more like a guild-like structure, which can exist only in relatively coherent community spaces, right? And so that's why I don't think the level of analysis for educational reform is not the level of the school. It's actually the level of the city or the region. That's the level at which you have to think about educational reform, or else you're not going to do anything. Because you can fix the little education thing, but you haven't fixed the community, and then the kids leave the education thing and enter a community that doesn't even want the skills that you've just given them, which is a classic problem for even the best independent schools and colleges, for that matter. So with that, I would bring you in. Because like one answer here is something like the civium notion, or something like this notion. Actually, we need to create a whole new way of living together in pretty decently sized numbers, or else we're not going to solve this education problem.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, just the only point there is just a reminder of the fact that it's a sticky wicket. If you do the analytical process and you look at each different component as its own piece, separate from the others, you can make a lot of progress at the theoretic level. But then when you try to reintegrate that into something that is actually embodied in physical reality, you begin to realize that it was never a separate piece in the first place. And the process was doomed to failure. So you have to be able to actually figure out, how do you get the level of clarity the theoretical process gets you, but then hold what an emergent wholeness of livingness actually is going to look like as all of the pieces develop simultaneously. Which is something, unfortunately, this arc of institutional schooling squeezed out of us par excellence. So it's not just that we have to, not do the schooling thing, but also that we're left by the schooling thing uniquely incapable of getting beyond it. So it's a sticky wicket.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that the field of psychology and education they're good intentions, but they become corrupt. And the reason is they try to measure stuff that they don't understand. They don't understand the contingencies in between. They create standards of learning that then become the outcomes, that then become the determinant factors, that then actually are total. The thing you measure versus the thing you're actually trying to do are very different things. But if you incentivize measurement outcome, it's called Goodhart's law, you fundamentally change that dynamic. So, basically we need a fundamental shift in our value structure and what it is that we are potentially socialized as. And that's why I love the way Zach talks about education. Get out of the schools and get into the fundamental growth potential, really, of being.
Totally.
Hey guys, Zach and Jordan specifically, if you guys are saying that this needs to be done in a hub and spoke kind of way on the community level, the micro community level, help me understand how that coheres with specifically trying to address media through the Consilience project?
Whoa, interesting. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you can't reduce education to schooling. And in fact, I've recently wrote a paper where one of the subtitles was screens win, schools lose. Which is to say that one of the reasons schools have become completely dysfunctional is because of the ubiquity of these guys right here. And so it's at this level that the innovations that the Consilience Project are trying to spawn and foster need to take effect. Because again, at the level of analysis for reform of education isn't the school or the family or any of these things. It's actually the whole city, and part of the city is these things, right? Which is to say, technically speaking, like, if we do jurisdictional or whatever the term needs to be around what happens in our spaces, we need to be concerned with the informational commons that's shared. And that's like the basic educational resource that is relevant. So it's in a sense like another angle at the educational crisis is the way I perceive the Consilience project. Yeah. And, again, it's a 5-year effort basically to try to galvanize a movement around basically kind of altering the informational ecosystem and the digital media landscape profoundly enough that it could actually become educative. Because right now it's not an educational experience. To be on a computer with a screen is not an educational experience. The internet's not. It's an informational environment. It's actually a predatory, extractive environment, but it's not an educational environment. It could be, and that was the promise of it. Just as the promise of television. When television came out, they spoke about it exactly the same way we were speaking about the internet in the 90s and early 2000s, that this will be the thing that brings education to everyone and saves democracy. And of course, PBS has existed, but mostly television, I wouldn't say, has saved democracy or educated many people. And so similarly, the Consilience Project, it's an ambitious play to try to change the nature of that basic dimension, which I think has become the main effect of childhood socialization now, which is to say these screens are actually running interference between the child and the family and the child and the school, so that the normative space that the child is brought up into, as I was speaking about before, the justificatory systems are actually not the embodied ones in their immediate co-located family system and school system, but actually a distributed and largely anonymous social field, which is intermediated by the screen and images. So that's one of the conditions for the possibility of healthy socialization in our day and age, is getting the informational ecosystem functioning well enough that it's, I mean, it's funny because I say well enough. It's like right now it's actually actively bad. Like it's actually damn, it's like cigarettes or something for adolescents, like it's toxic. So it's quite a lot that needs to happen. I mean, thankfully the situation is bad enough that as soon as you start pointing at it, kind of like with cigarettes, it'll be like, oh my God, how did we let this massive public health crisis run out of control? Well, profit is mostly the answer, and of corruption is a few other things. But I think we're going to look back at this day and age, especially with the youth, the way we look back like at Mad Men, where everyone's smoking cigarettes in little closed rooms, like, oh geez, right? We've destroyed the mind of an entire generation. So that's a little bit speaking to it. And there's a few other things that actually need to happen in the education space. There's something like the Consilience Project. There's something like changing the nature of like kind of academic or graduate level or university level research and teaching. And then there's something that needs to happen with the educational hub network that I've written about. Those three, and probably some other stuff I haven't thought of, need to all be in place. There's not one solution, as if we create the education hub network, but we don't fix the media system, like that's not going to work because the kids will be at the educational hub distracted on their cell phones looking at bullshit. So all those things need to lock in. So there's a lot of work to do in the space of education that has nothing to do with traditional questions of school reform.
So what's strategic plan 2.0 after the Consilience Project?
Probably something we should discuss offline and not on a publicly recorded call. But 5 years is a long time. So the idea would be that there's enough stuff that gets put in place as these 5 years unfold, where the strategic next steps will be super clear. This thing will become an auto-catalyzing movement is the ultimate goal.
Do you guys have another 15 or 20 minutes?
Sure.
We're at 90 minutes now. If I could slip in a question, I'm curious about the informal education we all receive in our family from our parents and that we give as parents. I'm curious how these metapsychology frameworks help define or mold or change the role of what it means to be a parent. I'm curious if you guys had a comment to that.
Well, I'll say if I start to internalize, say, Zach, so I'm a parent, I have 3 children, right? So, and I ask, well, how is it that I want to be to help position my relation to foster their growth, and do so in a way that when you look around the world and you're like, God only knows how the hell is it, what's the world going to be like in 20 years, people, right? Anybody thinks they know the answer to that? Let me know, but I probably won't pay attention very long to your answer. Okay. So how do I, what does that mean in relationship to how do I want to position myself? For me, I got to be clear about ultimate values. So yeah, I'm going to be guided in my system by dignity, well-being, and integrity. But I also then want to look at, well, what are they going to be prepared? What's going to allow them to be anti-fragile? What's going to allow them to be fundamentally good people at the level in all the possible different ecologies that they are likely to be a part of? So I emphasize, learn your skills. Yes, you have to do the status marker chasing for school. Okay. But if you actually, and for some reason in my lineage, my kids internalize that. So I'm always trying to break that down. I was like, don't fucking worry about it. It's just basically the whole system's corrupt. All right. So that's what I tell my kids as they get, oh God, I got a B+. It's like, let it go, and then it's like, but at the same time, what's the trajectory? What's the developmental trajectory? And so pay attention to your skill development seriously and learn how to educate yourself, and follow your self-determined interest, gain sovereignty there, be aware of the feeling system and what fundamentally drives you, okay, down into the core. Like, what is it that organizes your heart, into your body, and know how to attend from the narrator to the soul. And then obviously ensoulment, is then the analysis of that one. I often talk about one step down into your power, love, freedom, and then be aware of the depth as you become an adult, depth psychology, right? And your fundamental frame, and then what matters beyond you, okay? What matters beyond. So you have there, say, hey, well, okay, I'm going to position myself as a parent to work with my wife to cultivate a context where my kids are going to have effective development. They're going to manage their fundamental sense of personality and fundamental character, and they're going to determine what matters to them beyond their lives. That you get a nice skill development and ensoulment transcendence kind of set. And so to me, that's a very workable frame.
Well, one of the things I was noticing, I think with regard initially to Andy's question, is that there's a sort of a lurking commonality between many of these categories that we're talking about. and Zach named it, but he named it and just kind of zipped right by it. So I want to name it and slow it down, which is the concept of the term commons. And just to sort of put the spotlight on it, as far as I can tell, the thing that has been most evaporated over the past 500 years is precisely this notion of the commons. And in many ways, the notions of ensoulment and transcendence are deeply connected to the capacity and the, what do you call it? We call it the rehearsing and the regeneration of the commons, and to be able to be in relationship with other self and world in this fashion. We've almost completely lost the notion of what that even means, much less the skillfulness of doing it. Now, if you want to go really, really down into the very most basic form, or the center, the beginning, the naissance of the commons, you're now in parenting. And the most common commons is the relationship between mother and child at the moment of birth. And then it spirals out from there. And so simultaneously, it is the place at which we have the most availability to relearn and rehearse the notion of commons, and to remind ourselves of the essence of what that is as it begins to spiral out from there. But also the basis of that begins to become a resonant frequency for all else. Right? So if we say, for example, education, or we say, what was the other element that we had a few moments ago? Or even say like work, or no, it was media, education and media. Well, if we think of education and media as actually both most fundamentally need to be understood as examples of commons, and say, okay, well, if we try to use a way of understanding parenting, and I mean parenting in a very specific sense, right? We don't really even know what that means very well anymore, but parenting in its most fundamental essence as the tone of what then education and media would need to look like if we actually manage them as commons. A lot of things, frankly, get a lot simpler, but also more clear. Then what happens is I take this question about metapsychology and I place it into that context and say things like, we've already mentioned many of the different terms, like the notion of ensoulment. If I want to think about ensoulment from the point of view of parenting, well, it's a very different thing than we see quite often, right? Now, if I'm being in a relationship with my child with a notion of stewardship for not only their, sort of their earning potential and their capacity to have status in the social environment, but at least also their capacity or the realization of their ensoulment. Obviously, I have a very different set of things that I have to be able to consider, not the least of which is actually my own self, because the kind of self that I need to be able to steward the ensoulment of my child is a very different kind of self than if I'm simply focused on maximizing their earning potential, for example. So there's a lot of, if you drink deeply of the metapsychology elixir, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of things that start getting uncorked as you kind of move from me, myself, my relationships, and then the larger communitas or the world in which I'm in relationship in the context of these various notions.
Greg, please, because I don't have children, so this would all be.
I was just gonna say that one of the reasons that I'm obsessed with the problem of psychology is because I think what we need is what Zach, you brought some my consciousness metapsychology back. Jordan, you were talking with John Vervaeke and the ecology of practices, and oh my gosh, there's a metapsych tech, a metapsychological coherence that's kind of required. I really believe from my experience of threading here is that there's bridging to be built, and the other, in both an analytic, and then you take the analytic correction of what was lost and then you shine it onto the embodiment of being. And you set the stage then. And what you were saying, Jordan, another thing I wrote down, I was like, I drew it. I was like, that's right. The commons is the mother offspring, which, by the way, the fundamental proper attachment is high relational value dance. Okay, that's what that is. And then you spiral the high relational value dance into the commons to create a mutual relational value space with a proper metapsychology framing. I mean, that gives me goosebumps.
Next question, I think. Those are good answers.
If you guys didn't have any follow-ups to that, there's a question here from Christian Sawyer.
Hey, I was actually going to pass on this question because it was such a harsh departure from what we were talking about with education. But now that we're back on metapsychology, I think, feels good to ask. And it might be a very naive question because I'm not very educated about psychology. So you might have already said what I'm about to say and I just didn't hear it. But the idea that I was thinking about from what Greg was saying or both of you were saying about the movement from sentience to sapiens, or to from sentience to human, and that the problem of that. And the thing that occurred to me was that whatever we want to, however we want to characterize sapiens, what's available to me is this notion of active imagination. And like a kind of gross way to characterize that is like the trailers that you'll see on my hand when I move my hand across the screen, or which I might see in reality if I'm on like mushrooms or something, or just meditating and paying close attention. There's that that kind of echo, like these little tide pools of cognitive activity that I am aware of. And again, this is just naive speculation, but I imagine that it's not evolutionarily useful for like an animal to see tracers, to see like, 6 wolves instead of just one. And the fact that I can do that perhaps is what in some ways separates me from animals. And if so, isn't that kind of what then allows for me to create a social space? So I've got cognitive activity like language, which then my mind starts to be able to like bring into my consciousness in an active way, even though it's imaginal, such that I say like I project activity or behavior, like Zach is sitting there in front of me. I don't look away and like look back and like, oh shit, where did all these little faces come from? I have this held notion of what's going on, which to me just seems like a subtle imaginal overlay over this, Vervaeke's adverbial here-ness, now-ness of consciousness. And my question is, isn't that what, I don't know, but couldn't that be what makes the difference between sentience and sapiens? And if so, wouldn't that put the hard problem back at sentience itself, which is like, why is there a fucking experience happening here at all? That's my question.
Totally. I mean, the subtle imaginal overlays is the phrase that I pulled out there. And so one of the reasons I place ensoulment as primary and then transcendence and development as conjugate is this notion of the primacy of imagination, but you have to define imagination very specifically. In fact, almost in a Kantian sense. So when one of Peirce's most famous early papers, he tells you to trace a penny across the page, and at a certain point, you'll actually reach the blind spot between your two eyes. This is like a known visual illusion. You're saying, but you don't normally see the blind spot because you imagine it, which is to say, you all perception has this subtle imaginal overlay. Now, if you're like a Jungian, then this gets really interesting because then you start to talk about the imaginal realm and the relationship between the active imagination and the archetypes and the root metaphor that the archetype represents in the imagination, and the way that can color the subtle imaginal field of your actual perception. So this is just to say that, well, I'll say one thing. Many things co-emerge with that move at that joint point with the emergence of personhood and sapience. And we've mentioned a few, and I think this quality of imagination is one of them. And this is another way of actually saying that many animals perceive the world more objectively than humans because they don't have the capacity to have such a rich imaginal overlay. And it sounds counterintuitive. You'd think that, well, no, the humans are, but in fact, they have such limited perceptual capacity often that they're totally, completely cued in to the objective. Whereas the human actually encases the objective in this really sometimes very complex, and if you have psychopathology or neurosis, it can be actually ornately complex imaginal overlay on top of the given objective reality. And so some of the work in like healing things like depression is working at that level. It's actually working at the level of changing the root of your imaginal projection. And that's talked like the archetypal work that James Hillman does is that. We work up in the imaginal and then bring that down to the root metaphor of self, and that changes the nature of your imaginal projection. And so, yeah, a very interesting point to bring up. Yeah. So that's what that brought up in me.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that there are a lot of good reasons to believe that we start capacities for imaginal thinking in ways that are quite distinct. And I think Zach already brought up Tomasello and shared joint attention and our capacity for extension in time. Our capacity then for, I think there's mimicry and gesturing. And of course, we live unbelievably socially. And why I bring this up is because the social field adds a whole nother level of requirement of projection and potential, and then shared imaginal space. And then if we get into things like, if we start to have rhythm together and swell music together and things along those lines. So for me, these are all the massive precursors that are in between this primate and then emergent Homo sapien into personhood space. But I'll also say that for me, what happened in terms of my own analysis is that actually there is a very clear tunneling joint point that happens when we go from symbolic language into symbolic syntactical propositional language. And the argument is about 50,000 years ago, there was a lot of different prerequisite emergent elements. But when we tipped into propositional language, then something very different hooked off. And so for me, when we really talk about, well, what about sapiens and really human persons that are so distinct and discontinuous, it's that propositional yoking and the implication of what spins off in relationship to that.
I'll just do a quick follow-up. That ability to make sense of a propositional statement, is that tied to the capacity to hold something in imagination in a seemingly solid way? And is there a neurological understanding of that process such that we can just point to, this is what makes us sapiens? It's like this.
Now we've answered the question of where is math? It's in your imagination, like in a very technical sense. Like, well, there are imaginal numbers, first of all. But it is the case that you could think of math as a subtle imaginal overlay, as you were suggesting. I know, not to like split hairs, but I would actually disagree about the primacy of the propositional as the kind of like key of that joint point. As I spoke about before, especially with regards to like the McGilchrist notion that in fact there was some form of right hemispheric joint attention, which is more primary, which may actually be in the domain of ensoulment rather than development, which is where the propositional would be. Anyway, but this is splitting hairs, but there's certainly something happened that was tremendously important and complex. Yeah, very interesting. This conversation has become very interesting. Jordan,
yeah, I was going to say, who's this guy, Christian?
Yeah,
I really dig that question. I'd like to put it in your head in the context of distributed cognition. And what are the implications for this really collective imaginal that's actually happening in a way that is being held across some large number of distinct, what are we, sapiens? Is that the good one over here on the right-hand side?
Yeah, persons.
Yeah, distinct persons. There's like this surplus value of capacity that enables you to stitch together a series of percepts into a experience called hand and tracers. And then the nation is, okay, cool. What happens when you've got, I don't know what we got right now, 31 distinct persons sharing joint attention on a shared imaginal space, which no one of them could possibly hold. This is a very interesting thing that begins to emerge, where there's a way of actually being able to perceive something which is much larger that I can't actually perceive in myself, but is clearly real. And our joint attention is what is ensorceling that into actually being able to perceive increasingly as a real thing. I think Benita knows some stuff about that. Talked to her about that a few times.
Totally. I think Benita's here.
Yes, Benita here. Was at one point.
All right, last question.
My internet cut out, so I don't have access to the questions right now.
Okay. Someone want to jump in?
Let me get onto the chat, see if there's a. Does anyone want to jump in? I don't know.
Open mic.
I'll go ahead.
Okay, I had a question. Gregg, what's super interesting for me is how visual a lot of your models are. And Zach, from your lectures, the idea of imagery, how important and powerful that could be. I'm curious, like us as individuals, us as members of different communities, us as members of the Stoa, in our just daily lives, what are some images you think that could be useful to take away from this session and these metapsychology frameworks that we could then maybe come back to, and they can kind of be like seed crystals we can grow some of these habits and philosophies out of?
Well, the archetypal image that I carry around for is the garden. And since there was I think it was Andy asked a question about like the Conciliant project, and then what about local communities, and I also then we dipped down at one point through Jordan's comment into mother offspring. I was trained in Yuri Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model. And I basically I have this, for me, this image is this garden across all socio-ecological levels. That's essentially what I'm woven in. And it has meaning for me because, as I mentioned, I was raised as a new atheist. I'm married into a Jewish family. There's all this Genesis reference. And I really believe that somehow there's a process of science and theology and scientific humanistic ways of being, bridging that dialectic across scale from the heart into our relationships, into our family, into the communitas, and to generate what that potential might be, to sort of try to embody that as we try to be good ancestors in the, in terms of putting it in a time contingency. So that's one image I'll offer.
Wow. I mean, it's interesting because I go now to where I started my metapsychology lectures, which is images of psyche. So like, if I wasn't going to use language and I wasn't going to use diagrams, how would I represent psyche? And so I showed you guys images of the character psyche in the myth, Psyche and Eros, or Psyche and Amor, which was powerful. But there's actually a whole bunch of like kind of dream analytical work and archetypal work about what are the things in dreams and active imagination that actually represent the psyche itself. Like when your mind is like, pay attention to me. One of those things is actually window pane. And the other one is obviously a mirror. And so when we were talking about that joint point being the emergence of a whole bunch of things, one of them is self-reflectivity, right? And so the basic way I characterize what is metapsychology, it's the psyche's use of symbol, language, and image to know itself, right? And so I want to present that image, something like a mirror or a window or something along those lines. And so that would be the images. And then the ones that I presented at the beginning of my lecture, right? Psyche and Pan, Psyche and Eros, right? That you don't get Psyche without the big, great god of nature, dangerous, like rapacious, unpredictable, musical god of nature. You don't get Psyche without that. And you don't get Psyche without Eros, without love. And so those two images they're paintings, and also representations of psyche. So that's kind of where I went with that question.
I'm curious if Jordan has any thoughts.
Well, the only image I've got is the image of the smile in my wife's eyes, which I don't think you can have. So perhaps you can find something that has the same sensibility.
I think that's our I think that's our time for today. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Jordan. I think this is going to be the end of the recording. Greg suggested he may have a little bit of time afterwards once we turn off recording to have a little bit more of an informal chat. Zach and Jordan, if you have some time.
Like we're gonna roll.
Yeah.
This is fun though, guys. Later.
Hey guys, thanks for
Thank you, everyone.